If you're a Catholic parent and one of your children has stepped away from the faith, I want to start by saying something that I hear almost every single time that this comes up in my work. Parents will say, I know I'm supposed to trust God, but I'm terrified, or I can't sleep because all I think about is their soul. Or even more quietly, I don't know how to talk to my child anymore without making things worse. I just don't want to make things worse. And underneath all of that is usually one painful and persistent question. Did I fail them? If that's where your heart is right now, then this conversation is for you. Hi, I'm Amber Pilkington, Catholic therapist, wife, mother, and someone who's spent years sitting with faithful, loving Catholic parents who never expect to find themselves here. Parents who raised their kids in the church, who prayed, who tried to do the right things, and now are watching their children drift away, disengage, or even openly reject the faith. This is something I hear so often that I wanted to create what I'm calling here a free webinar because it's not flashy, because this topic deserves more space than a soundbite and more care than what can usually be found in the comment section. So today, I'm not here to give you a formula for bringing your child back to Mass, not going to hand you arguments or scripts or pressure-based strategies that will only increase anxiety on both sides. And I'm definitely not going to tell you that if you just prayed harder or parented better, this would not be happening. What I want to do instead is to help you understand what's going on, developmentally, psychologically, and spiritually, and how to respond in a way that preserves peace, protects your relationship, and keeps the door open for hope over the long term. Because here's what I know to be true, both from research and from real life. Panic doesn't bring people back to the faith, but steadfastness, love, and trust, well, they often do. So if you're carrying grief, fear, confusion, or that constant background ache that comes when loving a child whose spiritual life feels out of your hands, I'm really glad that you're here. We'll slow down and take a wider view and talk about what actually helps starting right now. And I'll put some chapter notes in the description, so if you want to skip to a certain section, feel free to do that. But let's start with the bigger picture. Before we talk about what to do or how to respond, I think we need to widen the lens a little bit, because one of the most painful parts of this experience for parents is how isolating it feels. When it's your child, it feels intensely personal, almost like a private failure, when in reality, what you're facing is something many Catholic families are navigating right now. The research is sobering, but it's also important because it helps take this out of the realm of self-blame. According to the Pew Research Center, about half of adults who were raised Catholic no longer identify as Catholic as adults. That number alone can feel shocking, especially if you were raised with the assumption that faithful parenting naturally leads to faithful adult children. But what matters just as much is when this disengagement usually begins. Data from the Center of Applied Research in the Apostolate shows that most young people don't suddenly leave the faith when they move out or go to college. For many, that process starts much earlier, often in early adolescence, around middle school or early teenage years. This tells us something important. What we're dealing with here is not just a cultural or intellectual issue, but a developmental one. The St. Mary's Press study, Going, Gone, looked closely at the experiences of young adults who had left the church, and what they found was not what most parents expect. Most of these young people didn't describe dramatic rebellion or outright rejection. Instead, they talked about slowly drifting away, often feeling disconnected, unheard, or unsure of how faith fit into their real, everyday lived lives. By the time they reach their early 20s, nearly 80% of those who would disengage have already disengaged. When researchers asked them why, the answers were complex but also consistent. Some struggled intellectually with belief. Others were deeply affected by perceived hypocrisy or the scandals. Many felt judged or unsafe asking questions. And a large number simply didn't experience the faith as something that spoke to their interior lives in a meaningful way. What's important here is this. Very few of them frame their departure as a reaction to their parents' faithfulness or lack thereof. This isn't a simple cause and effect story where doing everything right guarantees a particular outcome, and that's a really difficult but important sentiment to remember as parents. It doesn't make the hurt any less, but it does change how we interpret what's happening. If you're listening to this and thinking, but we did everything we're supposed to do, I want to say this: faithful parenting, it matters deeply, but it does not override free will, developmental timing, or the complexity of a person's spiritual journey. This is not a personal indictment of you. It's a broader cultural or developmental moment that requires discernment rather than self-attack. And understanding that is the first step towards responding with clarity instead of fear. This is not the end of the story. Once parents start to see the bigger picture, there's often a very understandable shift that happens internally. The self-blame begins to soften a bit, but it's quickly replaced by another worry. Okay, if this is common, then what does it mean for my child? Is this how the story ends? And this is where I want to also be very clear because fear has a way of filling in gaps that theology and psychology actually answer quite well. A child stepping away from the faith is not the end of their story, and it's not proof that God has somehow stepped back or given up. What it usually means is that their journey is unfolding in a way that doesn't match the timeline or the structure many of us expected, and that mismatch can feel deeply unsettling, especially for parents who were taught implicitly or explicitly that faithfulness guarantees a particular outcome. Grief belongs here. If you feel sadness, disappointment, anger, or even moments of quiet resentment, that doesn't mean that you lack trust in God. It means you love your child and you care deeply about something that matters. Scripture's full of people waiting, longing, praying, and yet not seeing resolution. And the Christian life has never been described as a straight line, from baptism to heaven without a single struggle. St. Augustine is often quoted here for his beautiful conversion story, but what gets overlooked is how long that process actually took. His restlessness, his searching, his resistance, all of it was part of the path by which God was drawing him closer, not evidence that he was lost. Conversion, when it's real and lasting, is rarely efficient, quick, or predictable. What I see again and again with parents is how quickly this experience turns inward. There's an almost automatic assumption that if something has gone wrong spiritually, it must be that something went wrong in parenting. If I had prayed more, if I had explained things better, if I were stricter, if I were more gentle, maybe this wouldn't be happening. Those things make sense, but they're also incredibly heavy and they place a burden on you that was never meant to be carried alone. Perhaps most importantly, at this point, we can't go back and change it. We can only move forward. They also quietly distort the story by turning a complex human journey into a single point. Your child is not broken. They're not a disappointment, and they're not the, quote, lost one in your family. They're a person who's developing, still discerning, still wrestling with meaning, purpose, and truth, and still fully known and pursued by God. And it's important that they know that you view them that way, not as the lost one. The church has always taught that God's grace is not revoked because someone struggles with belief or steps away from practice. St. Faustina records Christ's assurance that every soul is given the grace to return, even in a final moment of life. That doesn't mean that everything resolves quickly or neatly, but it does mean that despair is never a great response. What often needs to change in this season is the role parents imagine they're supposed to play. This is usually not a time for intensified instruction, constant correction, or heightened pressure. More often, it's a time for witness, quiet, steady, relational witness that communicates love without conditions. And this can be hard because when you're anxious or fearful, you naturally want to do something. And a lot of times that something means re-catechizing, pushing harder, but that can actually make things worse. When parents internally label a child as the problem or the one who left, something subtle shifts. Anxiety creeps into conversations, expectations tighten, and kids can sense that weight even when nothing is said directly. Over time, that can make the relationship feel fragile, as though it's always being evaluated. So instead of asking, how do I bring them back right now? Perhaps a more useful and helpful question is, how do I remain someone my child experiences as safe, steady, and loving, even in this tension? That question doesn't weaken faith. That doesn't mean that you compromise your values. It protects faith and relationship. This is not the end of your child's story, and it's not the end of yours. It's a different chapter, one that calls for patience, trust, and a kind of hope that may feel quieter, but is often much deeper. The 3 kinds of leavers. One of the most important things I want parents to understand is that not all young people who step away from the faith are doing so for the same reasons. When we treat every situation as if it's identical, we usually end up responding in ways that can miss the mark, sometimes with very good intentions, but with unintended consequences. Over the years, both the research and in my clinical work, I've found it helpful to think about 3 broad patterns that tend to show up. These aren't rigid categories and people can move between them over time. They're not exhaustive, but they can give us a much clearer sense of what your child might actually need right now. The first group is what I call the injured leavers. These are the young people who associate the church with real pain, sometimes through personal experiences of judgment or perceived hypocrisy or spiritual shame, and sometimes through exposure to scandals or stories that deeply unsettled them. For these kiddos, walking away isn't about rejecting God as much as it is protecting themselves from something that feels unsafe. From a psychological standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. When a person's nervous system links a place or an institution with threat, their instinct is to create distance. Pressuring an injured leaver to re-engage before that sense of safety is restored often intensifies their resistance. What they usually need first is not correction, but acknowledgement and an honest recognition that harm exists and that it matters. The second group is what I call the drifters, and this is actually the largest group. These are the young people who didn't have a dramatic rupture with the church. They simply stopped finding it meaningful or relevant to daily life. Faith may have been present growing up, but never quite integrated into their sense of identity, into their relationships or their sense of purpose. And developmentally, when young people are trying to figure out who they are, what they believe, and where they belong, this is a healthy psychosocial crisis to resolve. If faith remains mostly external, something that happens on Sundays rather than something that speaks to their interior life, it can fade into the background. For these kids, constant debates about doctrine often fall flat. Not because truth doesn't matter, but because the connection was never primarily intellectual in the first place. The third group includes the dissenters, and this is the group that often creates the most anxiety for parents. These are young people who have consciously rejected certain church teachings, usually on moral or social issues, and who may articulate their disagreement quite clearly and forcefully at times. What's important to understand here is that dissent is not the same thing as defiance, though. Very often, it's part of a still developing conscience, wrestling with complex questions. And this is why it's essential to keep the relationship strong, because dissent often becomes defiance when the person they are talking to is in a relationship with them that is insecure or unsafe or strained in some way. The church herself speaks directly to this process. In Dignitas Humanae, the Second Vatican Council reminds us that truth does not impose itself by force, but by its own inherent credibility. That teaching is deeply relevant for parents because it acknowledges something both theological and psychological. Belief cannot be coerced, being distorted. Each of these patterns calls for a different posture from parents. An injured lever needs safety and repair. A drifter needs meaning and connection. A dissenter needs respect and room to think without fear of relational law. And what they all need, however, is the same foundational experience: to know that the relationship with you is not contingent on agreement or performance. When that foundation is secure, faith has room to breathe. When even the most accurate arguments can become obstacles. Understanding which pattern you're dealing with doesn't give you a script or a quick fix, but it does help you stop reacting out of fear and to start responding with discernment. And that shift alone can change the emotional climate in your family more than most parents realize. Most parents don't respond poorly because they don't care. They respond out of fear. Fear about eternity, fear about meaning, fear about having failed at something that mattered deeply. And fear has a way of narrowing our options until we start doing things that feel urgent but actually work against the very outcome that we want. One of the most common responses that I see is what I'll gently call persistent reminding, bringing up Mass, prayer, confession, or church teachings again and again, usually in the hope that repetition will eventually break through. From a parent's perspective, this feels loving and responsible. And again, we're not talking about catechizing our children as they grow up. We're talking about adult children who've lost the faith. Your children know where you stand. They know what you believe. Psychologically, this persistent reminding in adulthood often triggers something called reactance. Reactance is a well-established concept in psychology that describes what happens when people feel their autonomy is being threatened. When someone senses pressure, especially around identity and belief, their instinct is to push back, not because the request is necessarily wrong, but because the pressure itself can feel controlling. James Bream first described this in 1960, and it's been replicated consistently since then, particularly with adolescents and young adults. So the irony is this: the more we push, the more we often solidify resistance. What was once uncertainty can harden into opposition simply because no one likes to feel coerced. Another response that comes from fear is guilt-based motivation. This might sound like subtle comments about disappointment, references to family sacrifices, or spiritual language that implies eternal consequences in a way that overwhelms rather than invites or instructs. Parents don't usually intend to shame their children, but shame can seep in very easily when faith becomes linked with a relational approval. The research on shame is very clear here. Shame does not lead to sustained moral or spiritual growth. Instead, it tends to produce avoidance, secrecy, or emotion. June Tengi's work shows that when people feel fundamentally defective rather than genuinely accountable, they're far more likely to distance themselves from the source of that feeling. In other words, guilt might get compliance for a moment, but shame erodes the relationship over time. There's also a pattern I see that I think parents don't always recognize in themselves, and that's what family systems theory would describe as over-functioning. When anxiety rises in a family, one member often compensates by taking on more responsibility, more emotional labor, more fixing. In this context, that can look like excessive monitoring of a child's beliefs, frequent theological debates, or feeling responsible to correct every statement that feels wrong. Murray Bowen's work helps us to understand why this backfires. When one person overfunctions, the other often underfunctions or distances in response. The more intensely a parent manages the spiritual situation, the more likely an adult child is to disengage. Not necessarily from God, but from the relationship where anxiety is concentrated. And then there's a quieter version of this, which shows up at family dinners, holidays, or casual conversations. Faith becomes the elephant in the room, or worse, the topic that hijacks every interaction. Parents may feel justified in this, thinking, if this is the most important thing, shouldn't we talk about it all the time? But the reality is, if your child already knows where you stand, and as an adult child, they likely do, restating it repeatedly doesn't clarify truth. It communicates tension. Over time, that tension can make being around you feel emotionally unsafe, even if your intentions are good. This is where that often quoted line attributed to St. Francis of Assisi becomes unexpectedly practical. Preach the gospel, always. Use words if necessary. This isn't an argument against teaching. It's a reminder that the gospel is first embodied, not enforced. What I want parents to hear clearly is this: stepping back from those patterns is not giving up. It's not moral indifference. It's emotional and spiritual wisdom. It's recognizing that faith grows best in an environment where relationship is secure, not constantly under review. The goal is not silence, and it's certainly not pretending that you don't care or that faith isn't important. The goal is learning how to hold your convictions without letting anxiety run the relationship. When parents can do that, something very important shifts and the temperature starts to lower. Conversations become possible again, and trust, which is the soil that faith grows in, has a chance to recover. So now that we've talked about what not to do, let's talk about what actually helps. Once parents stop doing the things that quietly escalate tension, the natural next question is, okay, then what actually helps? Tell me what to do. And the answer is probably less dramatic than most people expect, but far more powerful over time. What helps is relationship, specifically secure relationship. From a psychological perspective, one of the most consistent findings across decades of research is that warm, emotionally responsive parent-child relationships, even when those children are adults, have a profound influence on a young person's openness, not just to values in general, but to spiritual meaning in particular. Even when children disengage for long periods of time, the presence of a secure relational bond dramatically increases the likelihood that they will revisit questions of faith later in adulthood. Think about this. When your adult child does have a question, finds themselves in crisis, and wants a way back, you want to be the first person that they want to call. That's when they're inviting you in. That is when conversion and change is most helpful. Recent longitudinal research has reinforced this. Studies looking at religious disengagement and return later show that family warmth, things like emotional availability, respect for autonomy, even though there may not be agreement, and a genuine interest in your child's inner world, point of view, and opinions matters more than the frequency of religious instruction once children reach adolescence and young adulthood. In other words, the relational environment doesn't replace faith formation, but it often determines whether faith remains accessible later on. This is where respecting boundaries becomes essential, and I want to be very clear about what this does and doesn't mean. Respecting boundaries is not the same as approving every belief or behavior. It's about recognizing that another person's inner life cannot be managed from the outside without damaging trust. When parents honor boundaries, they're communicating something very important. Our relationship is strong enough to hold this difference without breaking. That message alone can lower defensiveness in a way that no theological argument ever could. We also know from the Gottman Institute's research on close relationships that people are far more likely to engage meaningfully around values defined as affection, curiosity, humor, and everyday connection. When a relationship becomes narrowly focused on one area of disagreement, it loses its elasticity, so to speak. But when parents stay engaged in a child's whole life, their interest, their struggles, their joy, and genuinely interested, not just for the sake of conversion, the relationship stays alive. This is where I often invite parents to take a gentle step back and to ask themselves a hard but very clarifying question. Does my child experience me as interested in who they are, or primarily concerned with what they believe? Most parents don't intend to communicate the latter. But again, anxiety has a way of shrinking our focus until belief becomes the only lens through which we can see and communicate and relate to our adult child. Your child is not a project. They are not a spiritual puzzle to be solved. They're a person with dignity, agency, and a soul that ultimately belongs to God, not us. When parents unintentionally objectify the spiritual outcome, when everything becomes about getting them back, Kids often sense that pressure and respond by pulling further away. One of the most helpful models here comes not from modern psychology, but from the life of St. Monica. Monica prayed relentlessly, but she did not pressure Augustine with constant correction or theological debate. She stayed close. She set boundaries. She remained present. She trusted that God was working, even when she couldn't see how. And when the moment came for Augustine to return, it wasn't because she argued him into belief. I have to believe it was because his heart had room to receive it. From a nervous system perspective, this makes sense. People are most open to reflection and meaning when they feel safe, seen, and respected. When the relationship is calm and secure, curiosity can reemerge. When it's tense and evaluative, self-protection takes over. This doesn't mean that parents should hide their faith or live inauthentically, not at all. It means allowing faith to be visible without making it feel coercive. Let your child see you pray because prayer sustains you, not because it's a message directed at them. Let them see how faith shapes your patience, your compassion, your steadiness, especially in moments of disappointment. Over time, this kind of witness does something subtle but profound. It keeps the door open, it preserves trust, and it communicates without words that faith is not a weapon or a test, but a source of life. And that, more than anything else, is what makes return possible. The role of prayer and relational trust. One of the hardest realizations for parents in this season is that love and influence are not always the same thing. You can love your adult child deeply, faithfully, sacrificially, and still not be the person that God uses to draw them back at a particular moment in their life. That truth can sting, especially for parents who have given so much of themselves to their children's spiritual formation through the years. But it can also be deeply freeing because it reminds us that salvation does not rest on our shoulders alone. Spiritually speaking, God has never limited himself to working only through parents. Through scripture and church history, conversion often happens through unexpected relationships, friends, mentors, spouses, moments of beauty, and seasons of suffering that open the heart in ways that argument never could. When parents try to control that process, even subtly, it can create strain that makes those other avenues harder to access. This is where prayer shifts in tone. Instead of praying from a place of urgency or panic, Lord, fix this, change this, make this happen now, I invite parents into a different kind of intercession. One that sounds more like, Lord, I trust you to love my child more than I do. Keep me faithful. Keep our relationship intact and preserve and prepare the people and you will use. St. Ambrose's words to St. Monica capture this beautifully when he reassures her that the child of so many tears will not be lost. What's often overlooked in the story is that Monica's role was not to orchestrate Augustine's return, but to remain steadfast while God worked through others. Her tears were not tactics, they were acts of surrender. Psychologically, this posture matters as well. When parents relinquish the need to be the primary agent of change, something in the relationship relaxes as well. Conversations become less loaded. Time together can feel safer, more fun, more connected. And paradoxically, that safety can make a child more open to reflecting on faith than carefully constructed conversations. It's also important to recognize that prayer itself can become anxious if we're not paying attention. Repetitive, desperate prayer can sometimes reinforce the belief that something is catastrophically wrong, which keeps parents in a heightened state of fear. Now, I'm certainly not telling you not to pray. I'm asking you to look at the emotional undercurrent. God does not require panic to act. Trust is not passivity. It's an active choice to place the outcome in God's hands while continuing to show up with love. Emotional trust grows when parents are consistent, calm, and emotionally available, even when the situation has not resolved. And that steadiness communicates something powerful. I am not afraid of your questions. I am not withdrawing my love, and I trust that your story is still unfolding. Sometimes the most faithful prayer in this season is simply asking for the grace to stay open, to resist the urge to withdraw or to harden or to make faith a battleground. When parents do that, they are participating in God's work in a way that is quieter, but no less real. You may never know all the ways that your faithfulness matters. You may not see the fruits in the way or on the timeline that you hoped for, but staying relationally available, prayerfully rooted, and internally grounded creates space for God to move in ways that are often hidden until much later. And that's not nothing. That is, in fact, a profound act of trust. As we begin to close, I want to come back to something very simple because when parents are hurting, simplicity is often what steadies us the most. You do not need to convert your child today. You do not need to find the perfect words, resolve every doubt, or somehow undo years of cultural and development forces that are much bigger than your family alone. What your child needs most from you right now is not urgency, it's steadiness. Peace, not panic, is what creates space for growth. Relationship, not constant moral battles, is what preserves trust. And hope, when it's grounded rather than frantic, allows God room to work. One of the quiet burdens many Catholic parents carry is the belief that if they stop trying so hard, something terrible will happen. That letting go will somehow signal indifference or spiritual laziness. But letting go of control is not the same thing as letting go of faith. In fact, it often requires more faith. Staying rooted when the outcome is uncertain is one of the most mature expressions of faith that there is. If nothing else, I hope that this time together has helped you breathe a little more deeply and see your situation through a wider lens, one that includes both trust and tenderness. Your love for your child matters. Your presence, it still matters. And your faithfulness, even when it feels unseen, is not wasted. There's always more support available than what parents realize. Learning how to regulate your own fear, how to stay connected without overstepping, how to pray with trust instead of desperation, these are skills, not personality traits, and they can be learned. Drop your questions, your hardest experiences, or places where our community can pray for you in the comments. Wherever you take the next step, I want you to hear this clearly before we end. God is not finished with your child, and He's not finished with you. This chapter may not look the way that you imagined, but it's still held within a much larger story, one marked by patience, mercy, and hope that reaches further than any of us can ever see.